the early 1990s. Super Nintendo. So, first on the list of the lost generation is the lowest selling machine out of it, the FM Towns Marty. Now, the FM Towns Marty was developed by Fujitsu as an extension of their FM Towns range of PCs. Now, the Marty was the peak of the FM Towns lineup, and as such was based around an AMD 386 SX processor running at 16 MHz. Yes, that's the same kind of AMD 386 SX you might have found in a Western-based DOS PC. Coupled with this were 2 megs of system RAM and video RAM at 640Ks, which comprised of 512Ks of dedicated video RAM and a separate 128KB bank of sprite RAM. This ran off a custom Fujitsu graphics chip which had a number of display resolutions varying from 256 by 240 pixels all the way up to 720 by 480 pixels. Now, that wasn't to say that was all this could do in terms of resolution. The FM Towns Marty could also do virtual resolutions all the way up to a whopping, for the time, 1024 by 512. Now, depending on the resolution selected, you had 3 different colour palettes to operate with: 4096, 32,768 or 16.7 million, and from each of these you could in turn display 16, 256 or 32,768 colours simultaneously. Now, there was some integer scaling available on there, which did help with some games, but the Marty only output through composite and S-video, so there are no other types of connection available. Now, given that this was an extension of the FM Towns range, it meant that some of the games available for it were developed as PC titles essentially, and therefore the Marty had to include a 15 kHz down scanner to allow these games to display correctly on a commercial television set. Now, in terms of audio, there's quite a beefy setup here. You had a Yamaha YM2612 6-channel FM synthesis chip combined with a Ricoh RF5C68 8-channel PCM chip, which could do 10-bit audio at 19.6 kHz. The system could also output CD digital audio through PCM playback, and this was your standard 16-bit 44.1 kHz sampling rate. Obviously, for storage, a CD-ROM drive was utilised, as well as an optional 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, which of course is what much of the older FM Towns software was supplied on. Now, following this, there was also a PCMCIA slot, much as you would find on a laptop, which could be used for a number of expansions, including some battery-backed SRAM and a modem. There was also allegedly the capability to use this slot for RAM expansions, but this was not actually true. The system came with a fairly standard joypad, which was made up of a standard 4-way D-pad with A and B buttons, a select and a run button, as well as an extra third button that was just there for usage. The system had 2 standard controller ports, a keyboard port, and you could also get a 6-button pad for the translation of Streetfighter II and an adapter to allow you to use your Capcom CPS fighter stick if you so owned one. Now, the Marty was relatively unpopular, although it was part of a much more popular overall range, and sold somewhere in the region of 45,000 hardware units in Japan. Outside of Japan, the Marty never saw a release. Of the lost generation, this was easily the least successful and the least popular option. However, it wasn't a bad machine, it was just, compared to what was already there, it wasn't a massive step up, and compared to what was just on the horizon, it was significantly behind. Of note, the legendary FMV shooter game Microcosm was developed and made its debut on the Marty, so at least it had that going for it. Next on the list of the lost generation is Commodore's Amiga CD32, which, as you can probably guess by the name, was a CD-based 32-bit console. Now, in terms of what it actually was, it was a consoleized version of the then recently released Amiga 1200 AGA hardware with a CD-ROM drive added to it. Now, quick rundown of the specs here. You had a Motorola 68EC020, which was running at either 14.32 MHz if you had an NTSC machine, or 14.18 if you had a PAL region machine. You would also have 2 MB of Amiga chip RAM, a 1 MB Kickstart ROM, which was the operating system, and 1K of EEPROM for game saves. As you can see here, they were advertised as the world's first 32-bit CD console. Technically true, but you know, we'll get to that. Now, they had the advanced graphics architecture chipset powering this, which had a 16.87 million core power with either 256 on-screen cores displayed in indexed mode or 250,000 cores in ham8 mode. A number of resolutions were available, everything ranging from the standard 320 by 200 Amiga resolution in NTSC up to 1280 by 400 interlaced, again NTSC, or the slightly higher 320 by 256 resolution up to 1280 by 512 interlaced on PAL systems. Now, the audio was provided by 4 8-bit PCM channels, which gave you effectively 2 stereo channels, and you had a 28 kHz sample rate. Storage obviously was provided by a dual speed CD-ROM drive, which had a proprietary controller. You had a headphone jack for volume control. You had 2 mouse or gamepad supports. There was a port so you could add a keyboard. There was a power switch. There was RF video out. There was an S video out. You had a composite video out. And with various expansions, you could add an MPEG decoder, and you could even turn it pretty much into a fully fledged Amiga 1200. Now, the CD32 actually did quite well initially on its release, accounting for, I believe it's way over 50% of all CD-ROM software sold during its initial release window. However, like many of these machines, it ultimately failed. The big reason for the CD32's downfall wasn't really a lack of software, although the software that was released was often just ports of standard Amiga games with some CD audio added on. And it sold a healthy 100,000 units, but it was ultimately crippled by the fact that as it was being released to market, Commodore were going into the throes of bankruptcy, so the hardware never really got that marketing push that you would expect it to receive, and it just didn't have the hardware available for people to buy. Ultimately, whilst it's true to say it is the world's first 32-bit CD-ROM console, again, it just, compared to what was already available, it wasn't a significant step up. Compared to what was coming, it was significantly behind. Next on the list is a system that people should be far more familiar with. It's Atari's Jaguar system. Now, the Jaguar was Atari's last roll of the dice in the home console market and launched towards the end of what you would consider to be the golden period of the 16-bit machines. Now, the Jaguar was quite a complex beast, being comprised of a fairly large number of custom chips, such as the Tom chip, which was a 26.59 MHz processor which handled almost all the graphics. It had a built-in 32-bit RISC GPU with 4K of internal RAM. It had a 64-bit object processor, a 64-bit blitter which could do Z buffering and Gurad shading. It had a DRAM controller built into it which offered 8, 16, 32 and 64-bit memory management options. This was paired up with the Jerry chip, which had a 26.9 MHz speed as well. This contained a 32-bit DSP with 8K of internal RAM. It was very, very similar, in fact, in its makeup to the Tom chip. It allowed for CD quality 16-bit stereo sound. The number of sound channels was actually limited by the software that was being used, so programmers could extract quite a fair bit out of it. It had 2 full stereo DACs to convert digital audio into analog audio. There was wavetable synthesis built in. and this also controlled the joysticks through a UART. Now, also embedded into the system was the venerable Motorola 68000 chip, which was meant to be used as a system manager to offer 16 and 32-bit control at 13.3 MHz. Unfortunately, this was actually used by many coders to operate game logic, which did hamstring the system, as it meant many of its games were basically just straight up 16-bit ports with slightly fancier looking graphics. Anyway, I digress. You also had 2 megs of onboard RAM, which was accessed over a 64-bit bus. You had ROM cartridges. This was the only system from this generation to still use ROM cartridges, I have to say, which could store up to 6 megabytes of data. There was a DSP port for linking multiple systems up. There was a composite video, S-video, RGB combined output. There was also a UHF socket, so you just plug it straight in using a standard UHF aerial. That was not present on the French version of the machine. You could also attach the COM links, which shipped with the Atari links, and the easiest way to tell whether you've got a power and NTSC version is by apparently the LED light for the power switch. If it's red, it's NTSC. If it's green, it's a PAL machine. Now, the Jaguar was Atari's last hurrah. It failed quite badly. The reason being, it was cartridge based and it didn't have the software support. Plus, as I've already mentioned, what software was released for it was often quick and dirty 16-bit ports with polished up graphics due to the usage of that Motorola chip in there. The complex way of getting the Tom and Jerry processors to work together was limited to very few games by very few developers, so we never really saw what the Jaguar was capable of, although in the right hands it could produce some outstanding looking games for the time, especially if you look at, say, Aliens vs Predator, Iron Soldier, that kind of game. But yeah, unfortunately it died a death, although it did shift over 250,000 units, making it more successful than the CD32 and the FM Towns Marty combined. The next machine in the lost generation is probably the most interesting piece of hardware in here, NEC's PCFX system. Now, in Japan and to a lesser extent the United States, NEC had seen some success with its PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 based system. Now, this was never released officially in Europe, although there was a solid grey import market for it, but in Japan the PC Engine was comfortably the number 2 machine behind Nintendo's NES and SNES later on in its life. Now, the PCFX was a strange one. Unlike the rest of the machines on this list, this machine focused almost solely on its 2D abilities. There was no 3D processing ability in this machine because NEC didn't feel that the market was strong enough and the hardware was capable enough to be worth it. So, when you watch games such as you'll see on screen now, it is a lot of 2D sprites and a huge amount of FMV. Compared to any other CD based console, this machine has more FMV going than anything else. Now, all this was powered by a HU62 32-bit system board with 32-bit V810 RISC CPU. It can display 16.7 million colours simultaneously and was capable of displaying FMV full screen at 30 frames per second, something which even at the time quite a few home PCs couldn't manage. Now, like the rest of the machines on this list, we actually have a reasonable number of units sold here. The PCFX officially sold 400,000 units in Japan. Now, the system was only on the market for a couple of years, not a huge amount of games, but it was NEC's reputation and name that sold the system. It's pretty easy to see why this one failed. 1, never released outside of Japan, and 2, absolutely no ability to handle 3D graphics, which of course is ultimately where the market was headed at the time. Now, the final game on this list of the lost generation consoles is easily the most successful of them and my personal favourite from this generation, the 3DO. Now, we all know about the 3DO. Like I said, it was the most popular one of this generation, but let's give it a quick rundown. The 3DO ran a 32-bit RISC CPU, which was an ARM 60 at 12.5 MHz. It had a customised maths coprocessor to go with it, which utilised 32K of it had 32K of save RAM. It was capable of resolution displays from 320 by 240 at 60 Hz, all the way up to 640/480 at 60 Hz, or 384 by 288 and 768 by 576 for 50 Hz PAL regions, with either 16-bit palletized colours or 24-bit true colour depending on the resolution. There were 2 video coprocessors which were capable of producing somewhere between 9 and 16 million pixels per second, which could be distorted, scaled, rotated and texture mapped. There was also the FC1 Madam graphics accelerator, which provided the 3D output for the system. The system board itself was quite a solid. It had 36 DMA channels, 2 megs of RAM, a whole megabyte of VRAM, 2 expansion ports, one of which notably could be utilised to house a video CD card. The sound was 16-bit stereo sound, full CD digital audio at 44.1 kHz. It would support 4-channel Dolby surround sound, and it had a custom 20-bit DSP to help with the audio. It used a dual-speed CD-ROM drive with a 32K buffer. It had a multitasking 32-bit operating system, which is probably a holdover from the fact that a lot of the guys that designed the 3DO hardware also worked on Commodore's Amiga range of systems. For hooking it up to your TV, you had what will be considered to be all the standard outputs. You had an RF modulator, you had composite video, which would do either your 3-pin red, yellow, white, or you could also utilise an S-video connector as well, which did make quite a difference to the image. Now, the 3DO, as I said, was the most successful of these machines. It was globally launched, much like the Jaguar, but it sold a fairly impressive 2 million units, and that is impressive when you realise that the launch price for the machine was somewhere in the region of $700 US, way more than anything else on the market at the time, unless you were buying a PC. Now, it's pretty easy to see why the 3DO never really succeeded as a mass market proposition. Firstly, the price. It killed it. $700, 700 British pounds, way out of the range of the vast majority of people. The lack of software as well. Whilst Electronic Arts were hugely behind the machine and pumped out a significant number of what would ultimately be quite important titles, such as the first proper 3D attempts at American football with the Madden series, the first Need for Speed title, a brilliant rendition of Road Rash, third-party support was somewhat lacking. You know, a lot of the big third-party companies, Konami, etc., did not produce software for the machine, even though the 3DO was very popular in Japan. But yeah, the 3DO, again, it's a good piece of hardware, just let down by the simple fact that it was overpriced and it hit the market at the wrong time. And yeah, I love the 3DO, but it was a failure. Now, ultimately, when it comes to discussing why these systems all failed on the market, there are a number of reasons that I've mentioned. There's price, there's availability. You know, a number of these machines were only available in Japan. But for me, more than anything else, it was timing. The 3DO and the Jaguar especially were global launches, but just as they launched in late 1994, we were really starting to see what Sony and Sega were doing with the PlayStation and Saturn. And ultimately, I think a lot of gamers chose to hang on because what was being seen from those systems looked so much more powerful and unique compared to what the 3DO and the Jaguar were doing. And it's quite sad, really. It was the timing. Had, say, these machines hit the market 12 months earlier, had the Jaguar probably would have had much more success had it hit the market 12 months earlier and got more, it may have been able to build up a bit more developer support at that point, because it was a massively delayed machine and obviously developers wanted to wait and see. And with the 3DO, if they could have hit the market earlier, and if they could have done something with the licensing models to manufacturers to help mitigate the fact that there was no software licensing fees coming in to subsidize the hardware, they could have had a fairly successful machine like that. I mean, it still sold 2 million units, and that was even once the PlayStation and Saturn launched. So, it could have done a lot better, but as I said, this is the lost generation. It's an entire generation of machines which, if you go on places like Wikipedia, get lumped in with the Saturn and the PlayStation, the N64 as 5th generation. To me, they're more of a 4.5 generation. They're neither one nor the other. They're not quite powerful enough to be next generation machines compared to the Mega Drive and the SNES, but they're too powerful to be direct peers to those machines. And this was a cause for some distress. This effectively killed Atari as a hardware manufacturer, the venerable name in video game hardware at the time. 3DO, which was showing great promise, and especially if you look into it and you go and look for the 3DO M2, which was looking like it was going to be a real solid piece of kit, just died a death, unfortunately, and became a software-only house churning out dozens of Army Men games for years. But anyway, these have been my thoughts on The Lost Generation. I hope you've enjoyed them, and as I said at the top of the video, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you enjoyed this content really, really a lot, subscribe as well, hit the notification bell, and I will see you on my next video. So long.